Long unemployment lines are filled with former factory workers, all complaining about their jobs being shipped overseas by companies who will hire foreigners to do the same work for much cheaper. Back home, families struggle to readjust to the collapse of tens of thousands of once prosperous and high-wage factory jobs, prompting many to simply pack up and leave to a different part of the country in hope of finding work, any work. But this isn't the Rust Belt of the 1970s and 1980s America. This is Ulsan, South Korea, and this is happening today. You might know Hyundai from their automobiles, but that's just part of a company that spans several different markets. One of those key markets has for decades been the construction and manufacturing of cargo vessels and offshore oil and gas platforms. Globalism may have seen a collapse of the manufacturing job market in places like the US and Europe, but it also dramatically increased international trade, and with billions of tons of goods being shipped around the world, for decades the demand for huge seagoing cargo vessels made Hyundai a very rich company. Add to that the explosion in offshore drilling for oil and natural gas, and Hyundai could barely keep up with demand. Yet today, Hyundai's huge manufacturing yard in Ulsan, South Korea, where many of the world's largest vessels were constructed, is mostly quiet these days. The demand for large cargo vessels and offshore platforms is just as big as ever. But South Korea's rapid modernization saw legislature that increased benefits mandated by law for workers, and unions banded together to demand fair wages for workers taking huge risks in dangerous construction. Like dozens of American and European companies before it, Hyundai simply decided that the cost of building things at home was too high, and so began to move its operations overseas to countries with little regulation to protect its workers, where those same workers could be paid less and compensated little for injuries and accidents. For workers in Ulsan, they could expect to make triple South Korea's annual average, working at one of Hyundai's shipyards or auto factories. But starting in 2015, 27,000 workers began to be laid off by Hyundai. Many of these workers were then forced to take minimum wage jobs to support their families, or simply try and move to find work elsewhere in the country. Whereas Ulsan used to be South Korea's richest city in 2007, today it's the nation's most rapidly aging city as people move away in search of better opportunities. For those that stay, the suicide rate is incredibly high, with the country's highest suicide rate for people aged between 25 and 29 years old. In the first half of 2018, the city saw 182 suicide attempts, compared to 150 a year earlier. With the suicide rate rising, taxi drivers have been instructed not to drop people off on Ulsan's newly built bridge, which spans its bay, after 3 individuals killed themselves there in just 1 month. Suicide prevention specialists say that people bought into the fantasy that if they worked hard and studied hard, they'd be better off. But with an exodus of jobs, that fantasy has turned into a nightmare of hopelessness, where killing oneself seems to be the only option for many. But what exactly went wrong with Hyundai to bring South Korea's crown jewel to such an impoverished state? Some blame unions and rising labor costs for Hyundai's decision to move operations overseas. And while this did have some bearing on the situation, it's simply not an overwhelming factor in Hyundai's decision. As nations modernize and living standards rise, their workforces tend to unionize and demand more benefits and fairer compensation. This cuts into a company's profits by raising the cost of labor. Opponents of unions in both the US and Europe have long demonized the organizations, blaming them for the loss of high-wage manufacturing jobs they were fighting to protect. Yet with access to markets around the world and greatly efficient manufacturing techniques, the cost of a fair-wage labor force is minuscule for a company who manages their businesses and finances well. And this is where Hyundai has failed at repeatedly. Industry experts point out that Hyundai's inability to handle competition from China and a deep complacency and risk aversion that comes from Hyundai's near monopoly on South Korea's shipbuilding and car manufacturing. That complacency and risk aversion shouldn't come as a surprise, given as Hyundai is just one of a handful of chaebols, or family-run companies, who have near complete domination of their respective markets. With little competition to fear, these chaebols have lapsed into a deep complacency, and believing their profits to be secure, refuse to take risks that companies facing fierce competition are forced into, risks that often see major market breakthroughs. In short, Hyundai has long dominated in South Korea and failed to address international competition. Its short-sightedness also came in the form of missing out completely on the USA's SUV boom, with its auto branch joining the SUV game too late in the game to remain a sales leader in America. Hyundai also failed to take risks in the electric car boom, and now faces stiff competition in an uphill battle when facing off against competitors who are now prominent names in electric cars. Ulsan's woes, however, aren't completely Hyundai's fault. South Korea's over-reliance on exports to power its economy has seen it become very vulnerable during a time of growing protectionism in the US, China, and other nations, as well as leaving it vulnerable to other international shocks. When the confidence or purchasing power of consumers in the foreign markets it depends on so much is shaken, South Korea's exports fall dramatically, which has a huge effect on its economy. Once again, South Korea's chaebols routinely hold the nation back, and their near-complete monopolies place the nation in serious economic jeopardy. Should one chaebol collapse or falter, as Hyundai has faltered, it has huge repercussions across the nation. In South Korea, the top 10 companies have revenue equivalent to 66% of the country's gross domestic product in 2017. That's compared to America's top 500 companies earning 65% of the US's GDP. As the world continues to grow more protective of domestic industries, thanks in no small part to the US-China trade war, South Korea forecasts that its export growth will slow to 2.5% in 2019, down from 15.8% in 2017, a difference of tens of billions of dollars. While Hyundai claims that it will hire tens of thousands of new workers for its auto plants to make up for the losses in its shipyards, Hyundai has already moved significant production offshore to cheaper markets, and domestic output is expected to hit 37%, down from nearly 80% in 2004. Ulsan's story is one many Americans living in the Rust Belt are familiar with. Once prosperous communities suddenly find that the jobs they've relied on for decades are being shipped overseas, where labor is less protected and cheaper. Globalism may have connected the world and helped ensure world peace by promoting international trade, but it has also decimated the industrial sectors of many first world nations. Yet, as South Korea has shown us, as more of the former cheap labor markets start demanding fair wages and benefits for dangerous work, manufacturers are going to start running out of places to find cheap workers to exploit. Many African and South Pacific nations, sanctuaries of cheap, easily exploited labor for decades, are even now enacting stronger worker protection laws and instituting minimum wage laws. One day, these exploitative companies will simply have no cheap labor markets to flee to and be forced to return home. Unfortunately for millions around the world, that homecoming is going to come far too late to matter anymore. If you found this video interesting, I suggest checking out Insane Ways El Chapo Escaped Prison. Thanks for watching, and as always, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. See you tomorrow.